welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to be in your company. It's been great just reading through the chats and seeing some old, new alumni from different courses across the university. Thanks for being here. I'm delighted to share with you this research that we've started in 2024 October. What I'm going to do over the next few minutes is to share with you where we've started from, why we're doing this, and some of the early lessons that we've gathered from the field whilst working in the different countries that Dr. Massey kindly mentioned. To start with, I'd like to hear from all of you. Who do you think is more affected by climate change? So we've set up a poll on Slido, and for those who may not be used to Slido, it's easy to use. If you just go on your browser, slido.com, you'll find a space where you can put in a number and just type in 4287611. Or you can just scan the QR code on the screen with the camera of your phone. If you have a mobile phone that's connected to the internet, that's another easy way to do it. It'll be really great to hear from you what you think. And you don't have to think too much about it. There's no right or wrong answer. Just who do you think is more affected by climate change? Men or women? And I look forward to hearing and seeing the responses that you give to this. If anyone has any challenges with accessing the Slido or taking part in the survey and wants to, please just put in a message in the chat and my colleagues will be happy to support. Thank you for that. So, Dr. Massey mentioned that the research is funded by the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship, and I just thought it might be relevant to give a brief overview of what the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship stands for. So this is funding that comes from the UK government, specifically the UKRI or UK Research and Innovation, which is a non-departmental public body that's sponsored by the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Now, the funding in itself is an interesting one because it's not only focused on people or researchers in academia or universities, but it's actually open to fellows, as they're called, who are either in universities, research institutions, or businesses across the UK. So in the round where I was awarded, which was the 8th round, I think there were about 64 fellows across the UK working in various contexts, universities, research institutes, businesses, some of them in labs and all of that. And the priority for this fellowship is to ensure that there is high quality people's development, but also good policy engagement and wider impact from the research. So essentially, it's about addressing real life challenges, not only through providing theoretical responses, but also by providing very practical responses that could support people's well-being and sustainable societies. And this is for 4 years. So I'm going to be working on this until 2028. And I'll be very keen to have you come on board and collaborate on this. So
Dr.
a bit about
Barney,
the
sorry to interrupt, but we've got a question in the chat, someone asking if we could send a link to the Slido questions. Would it be possible to go back to that slide and just run through that again? We might have other people joining as well who are interested to contribute as well. Thank you very much.
No, that's no problem at all. Thank you for that. So maybe what we could do is also to put it in the chats. If you could maybe help type in the chat area, slido.com, and
Absolutely.
then the number is 4287611. So that people can just go back to it. I hope that works now.
Yeah, I'll post that in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Obani.
Cheers. Thank you very much. And so a bit about the research context and how we got to doing this. I should say that my background's in law, unsurprisingly, as I was introduced as being in the School of Law. But even though my background's in law and I've had a bit of practice with litigation, my focus has always been on understanding the role that law plays in advancing societal well-being. And so I always explore law as one instrument amongst others. And I want to understand the ways in which law interacts with other instruments for societal well-being and development. And on the back of this, I thought, there's been a lot of celebrations around climate litigation over the past few years, especially. and a lot of celebrations of climate cases and the courts as playing an important role in advancing climate action, in holding companies to account or businesses to account, especially um, businesses that are within carbon intensive sectors, but also as an opportunity to hold governments to account and get them to do what's right in terms of climate action. But then I thought it would be important to also interrogate the ways in which these cases are actually delivering justice or not for people in situations of marginalization or vulnerability, or people who aren't within the so-called corridors of power, or those who are not necessarily part of the decision-making processes. And that's how I started to look at climate litigation, specifically within the context of Nigeria and South Africa. And when I looked at those two countries, one of the things that I found was it's generally said that women are very often amongst the poorest people in society. At the same time, very often people say that litigation is an expensive process. And so for me, it just seemed like a no-brainer to consider that if women are very impacted by climate change or disproportionately impacted by climate change, and if women are also very often poor, and if at the same time litigation is expensive, then chances are that women would be unable to access justice through the courts. And then I started looking at the laws in each of those countries to see the extent to which they were either supportive of women's access to justice or not through the courts. And unsurprisingly, I didn't find a lot of provisions within the legal framework that were supportive of women's access to justice through the courts. And that made me question the role of the courts, the role of laws, and the opportunities which exist for women to engage with legal processes in order to seek redress when they suffer harm from climate change. Now, this isn't an African problem because perhaps some of us heard about the case in 2024 where some Swiss women actually went to the European Court of Human Rights in order to enforce their rights and seek redress against the violation that was impacted by climate inaction through the Swiss government. And in that case, for instance, the women had gone through the legal process within Switzerland, weren't satisfied with the outcomes, and approached the European Court of Human Rights. And what we found was that even in that instance, the women were able to get a judgment that was supportive of their claims for climate action from the government, but the government said, well, they had done enough as far as they were concerned. So within the context of Switzerland, within the context of a legal system that was accessible to the women who had actually gone to court and received judgment, there was still a barrier to accessing climate justice. And this actually highlights the point that climate justice needs to be intersectional and we need feminist approaches for it to be effective. So we need to explore and ask ourselves, beyond the fact that the laws exist, the courts exist, and perhaps there are administrative agencies that are involved in climate governance, to what extent are these systems or institutions accessible for those who are most impacted? And when we think about the impacts, we need to explore not just a homogeneous group, but to try and understand the different attributes of members of the group that would affect their experiences of climate change. And I'll share a bit more about this when I explore some of the early lessons that we found from the field. Now, the other thing that we found in terms of why we're doing this research is that even when the data exists about climate change and climate impacts, it is very often not disaggregated. And so we find that the laws that are made, the policies that come out, and the governance process is then blind to the gender dimensions of climate impacts, which are actually very critical. The other reason is that the dominant discourse, like I mentioned, on climate justice through litigation is just not working. And what we find is that we still have women resorting to protests rather than engaging in legal mobilization. And that shows clearly that there's a gap and the legal process needs to be reviewed in a way that ensures that the experiences and the context and the priorities of women are reflected within the legal institutions. And by extension, it also means that even other institutions for climate governance need to be reviewed. And if we review them through a feminist lens, we very often find that there are gaps that need to be addressed, whether you think about climate funding, or you think about the decision-making process, because what you find is that women are underrepresented in most of the spaces. So a feminist analysis of the climate governance process really does show gaps, and these are some of the things we want to address in this research. So in terms of the goals of the research, one, we want to understand and clearly map the key stakeholders and institutions that are involved in climate change governance. And by so doing, we want to understand the ways in which these institutions are either representative or not, and understand where they are not representative, what are the barriers to inclusive governance, and how can we mitigate those barriers and ensure that the governance process is more representative for women especially. The second thing we want to understand is what are the differences and the impacts of climate change on men and women. And the reason for this is because even though anecdotally people would say in very many cases women are more affected, and to be fair, there are some sources of data out there, but they're very often either incomplete or incoherent or non-existent. And so one of the things we want to do is to start building a credible body of evidence which clearly shows the varied impacts for men and women in different contexts. And we also want to go beyond the current discourse, which is very often around women are negatively impacted by climate change, women are vulnerable to climate change, to actually assess the role of women in climate resilience. Because there's evidence of good practice from women, there's evidence of women's agency, but this is just not part of the mainstream discourse. So we want to also explore what are the ways in which women are contributing to climate change and climate action, and how can these be mainstreamed to ensure gender equality in the climate governance process, including policies, programs, and relevant systems. And how are we doing this? So we're doing this by looking at our case study countries. So when I first put in the application, I focused on the three case study countries, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. But since starting these conversations, there's been a lot of interest within the UK context as well. So we've started doing some work around the UK in terms of exploring the key questions of what is climate change? How does it affect men and women differently? What are the kinds of impacts that people experience, and what are the factors that affect those impacts? Where are the spaces where people can actually voice their impacts and seek redress and even seek support to mitigate any adverse impacts that they're experiencing? And what are the strategies which people need to improve their climate resilience? So these are the key questions we're asking, and we're asking them across all four countries, that is Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, as well as in the UK. So for Women's Month, for instance, we had a series of workshops and focus group discussions, some in person and one online, covering these questions. And it's the result of those interactions that I'll be sharing with you today. Now, in doing this, we're conducting desk studies where we're having the focus group discussions, like I've mentioned. We're also going to be having expert interviews with relevant stakeholders that they identified through their interest or influence or impact on the process of climate governance. And we'll also be having online events such as what we're having today. Now, there are multiple communities of practice and stakeholders involved in this process. So even though my background is in law, the research is interdisciplinary. And in the course of the conversations, I've had to talk to colleagues who are professionals in economics, politics, feminist studies, health studies, inclusive development studies, and various other disciplines. And beyond that, the idea is to also look at even non-academic communities of practice as well, including community groups and representatives of local groups. So we're going to be looking at this at different levels. So at the local level, we'll be interacting with people in communities, but at the national level, we'll also be interacting with civil society organizations, regulators, relevant agencies of government, whether ministries, departments, or institutions, as well as looking beyond the academic space to also look at other spaces that could influence behavioral changes and institutional and system changes to improve inclusive climate governance. And the pathways through which we're hoping to achieve the outcomes of this research are capacity training, capacity building and training of people in terms of building capacity and understanding of what inclusive climate governance means, what the barriers are, and opportunities for addressing those barriers sustainably. We'll also be engaging in policy work, as well as using the creative arts as a medium for not only disseminating the message of the research, but also as a medium for trying to change people's attitudes and behaviors towards climate governance. Because some of the key barriers that women experience in terms of accessing justice or in terms of their human rights and well-being are very often deep-seated values and built out of people's perceptions and responses to situations. They're not necessarily tangible things because very often you would hardly find people who would come out and say that they are not supportive of gender equality. So a lot of it is deep-seated, and we want to be able to address those through creative arts. And then we have partners from academia, civil society, activist groups, and we're also trying to engage in storytelling so that the marginalized voices around climate governance can be amplified. And that's why, for instance, we've invited you today to take part in the poll, and we're also inviting you to stay in touch and keep exploring the various aspects of this research and let us know if you would like to get involved and how. Now, I'll move to the early lessons that we found. In terms of those early lessons, the impacts of climate change are varied. So a lot of the conversations brought out concerns around heat waves, concerns around droughts, concerns around flooding as well. So these were some of the key concerns that were raised. And in some cases, there were also concerns around air quality and air pollution linked to carbon intensive sectors such as transport, and especially transport where cars that are reliant on fossil fuels are being used as against electric vehicles. Now, each of these have very clear implications for women's health and well-being. So, for instance, there was a lot of conversations around women who are pregnant or women who have caring responsibilities and the way in which the heat waves would affect them, their health, their well-being, and their ability to meet their caring needs. There was also concerns around the care burden that is increased when women are impacted by these adverse environmental conditions, or when their families or the young ones who they're caring for, or the elderly who they're caring for, are adversely impacted by these um, environmental issues linked to climate change. And there was also questions, or there were also experiences of violence, increased domestic violence as a result of emergencies such as flooding or drought, leading to a breakdown of family relations, leading to a breakdown of even social relations, and really impacting on members of the family. The other impact that has come through is nature, unsurprisingly, because of course the flooding, the droughts, the heat waves, and the air quality problems also have implications for the natural environment. So things like water quality are affected. It's either there's a loss of water in terms of surface waters drying up completely, or there's an impact on the quality of water available, which also has implications for the women's ability to meet their caring needs at home and in the wider society. And for nature, there's also a very clear link to professions or livelihoods or work experiences that are dependent on natural resources. So a lot of women who would be engaged in agriculture, for instance, are then also exposed to a loss of livelihood and loss of work opportunities due to adverse climate change impacts. There's also implications for energy because, again, the adverse climate change impacts are impacting on access to energy sources, whether people are relying on hydropower or whether they're relying on other sources of energy that are impacted adversely. Because, for instance, there's a loss of infrastructure during a flood, or there's a loss of infrastructure as a result of damage from a sudden environmental problem, or a wind disaster, or even a heat wave destroying the physical elements of the infrastructure. So these are some of the impacts that were experienced. And in terms of education, that was also highlighted as an impact because very often, if there's an increase in the caring burden or if there's an increase in loss and damage due to adverse climate change impacts, and if a family has to make a decision as to where to invest in terms of education, it comes through that it is usually the boys who are invested in terms of their education as against the girls. And so if a decision has to be made and there are lane resources, it is usually the girl's education that is impacted adversely compared to other members of the family. And so these are some of the impacts that are already coming through from what we found in the conversation so far. And for students in universities, there were some students in some universities in other countries outside of the UK who were talking about having received circulars from the university saying, well, there's going to be a water shortage. And that has implications for them being able to study and study comfortably, because it means, for instance, they have to ration when to do certain things, their domestic well-being, their hygiene, because there's no easy access to water, or because there's no easy access to electricity, because there's a rationing going on as a result of the negative impacts of climate change. So these are some of the things that have come through so far, and we're building on this because we'll be going into communities next. And when we speak to communities, we'll get a bit more evidence. And part of what we're going to do is we're going to look at communities across the different climatic zones in each of the countries. So from the plateaus to the dry regions, to the coastal regions, to the Sahel, we're looking at all of the different climatic zones in each of those countries. And the idea is to see if there are similarities or differences across the various countries and see what lessons we can learn that could perhaps inform a regional policy outcome as well. Now, in terms of the drivers of these impacts which women experience, what we found is that the impact isn't the only thing that affects the ways in which women experience climate change. But there are other key factors as well. Sometimes it's about the demographics of the women. So, for instance, where they live, how old they are, their caring responsibilities, how much money they have, and all those other social attributes which affect the impacts of climate change that they experience. So, this is where an intersectional approach becomes critical. The other thing we found that's really important is also the vulnerability of the women. And this vulnerability is sometimes born out of wider social structures and systems beyond their own personal attributes. The other thing that's come through is that the level of exposure is also really important. So, for instance, if there is heat wave, if there's a heat wave going on and a woman is engaged in activities which mean that she needs to be out in the open, then she's more adversely impacted than if she was in a shelter somewhere. And in relation to that, the quality of the shelter is also very important. So, for instance, if a woman is living in a house that is of good quality and there's a flood, chances are that she will be able to manage that process a lot better than someone who's living in an accommodation that is made of less quality materials. And of course, that is also linked to poverty and other livelihood resources as well. So it's very interlinked, the ways in which some of these drivers are coming through. But the key thing is that it's not just about the impact, but it's about so many other factors impacting the experiences that women have. There's also the element of adaptability, which is sometimes dependent on the level of education and the type of education as well, because some of it isn't necessarily about formal education, but it's about understanding the context within which they live, the kinds of challenges they are experiencing due to climate change, and understanding how best to adapt to those changes. And finally, their involvement in the decision-making process, because if they're not involved in the decision-making process, then it means that the outcomes, the policies wouldn't necessarily reflect their priorities, their needs, their context in a way that advances their well-being and access to climate justice. So these are some of the key lessons we've learned so far, and we're hoping to build on these. And so to close, I would again like to invite you to take on another Slido survey. I'm hoping that we're now experts at doing this, having done it in the beginning. So if you scan the QR code or if you put in 6134383, they're just three short questions to understand your views on, first of all, do you still think, who do you think is more impacted, having gone through this webinar and reflected in some of the conversations? And when we go into the Q&A as well, based on those, what do you think? And secondly, how do you think we've delivered the session? And finally, if you have any other thoughts, whether at the end of the webinar or even subsequently, please feel free to reach out. The research has a page on Instagram, and I've just put on there the QR code to the Instagram page. Please feel free to follow us and we'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obani, for a fascinating presentation on this very interesting and impactful area of research. I'm really excited to see some of the questions come in already. Alumni, if you have any questions, please do post them in using the Q&A function. I can see that there's a lot of people joining us today who have links to this area of research or links to policy and law, and it would be wonderful to get your questions to shape the discussion as well. I can see a question from Joanna there about a QR code. I think that's for the Slido, which we're going to be posting a link to in the chat shortly. But yeah, folks, do get your questions in. We've got a couple here to kick things off, Dr. Obani. So first one from Kathy Grant, which is about the selection of countries for the study. So it is, why did you choose Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa for this study?
Thank you very much for the question. It's not only because I'm Nigerian. That's a real reason why I've selected those countries. So thanks for asking. Now, the reason is because, to start with, as I mentioned at the beginning, I started looking at this area of research from climate litigation. That was my entry point. And if you look at the climate litigation databases, there are very few cases from Africa. Most of the cases are from North America, and then you've got European cases and a few other countries. And when I started, in fact, there was just a handful of cases recorded within the African continent, which I found a bit strange, because on the one hand, there's a lot of, in Nigeria, for instance, there's been a lot of litigation in relation to oil pollution cases and cases that are really linked to climate change. So to think that for Nigeria, for instance, there was just one case mentioned, there was clearly a gap there. And the other reason I picked the countries was beyond the fact that Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa were the countries that at least were featured in the climate litigation databases at the time. So at least there was something to start with. Each of these countries also presents a unique position within the climate discourse. So Nigeria is heavily dependent on oil and gas as a major producer and exporter. And of course, its economy is really tied to that resource. And so any conversation around climate action would have implications for the stranding of those assets and the ways in which development occurs in that country. So that's for oil and gas. In South Africa, it's coal. So South Africa has a lot of investments in coal. Again, there are very unique circumstances around coal mining and the experiences of women within that context, which I thought would add real insights, which in Nigerian case wouldn't show, for instance. And then for Kenya, Kenya's doing a lot around renewable energy. And there's also been a lot of progress with holding the government to account, not only from the point of collective action, but also from the point of youth voices as well. So again, I just thought that would be an enriching case study to you. So each of them represents a slightly different context, which I think could be aggregated to provide a better understanding of climate governance at a regional level, building on the similarities, but also the differences. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Obani. I'm going to go straight into another question, actually, which seems to follow on really nicely. It's from Bianca. Really nice to see you joining us today, Bianca. Hello. I'm going to read the whole question. It is quite a long because there's some reflection in there, but I think it's really valuable, so I will read it all. Given the inclusion of the UK, will you do a comparative analysis between the challenges faced by the Global South versus the Global North? I think it would be quite interesting. I often struggle to find examples of how women are being impacted by climate change policies in Global North countries. In most examples, the main emphasis is on women in developing countries. I come from Romania and have lately started looking at this climate gender intersection within the national context. Also, congratulations for this much needed research. So yeah, the question is about challenges faced by Global South versus Global North.
Thank you so much for that question, Bianca. And it's just spot on, because that's one of the things you find within the Global North. It's almost taken for granted that there are no feminist dimensions to these, and the policies are applicable to everyone in the same way and just work perfectly. But I'm also a local town councillor, and in my town council, I chair the climate committee. And so I've seen firsthand through community action the ways in which it just makes a difference. So for instance, we're at a public meeting where a project was presented on retrofitting. And just reading the room, the responses that came from the women in that meeting were very different from the responses that came from the men. And so it made me think, with all the conversations going on around net zero, retrofitting, the government is almost approaching it as a neutral thing, which everybody will just key into. But the experiences from that public meeting show that there are some barriers, and perhaps we wouldn't find as many women getting involved in these conversations as we would expect or hope, because of these differences. And maybe the messaging has to be different. Maybe the investment in skills development have to be different, taking into account these variances and a feminist lens. So I do agree that even within the UK context, it is important, which is why I have now started expanding the focus to explore the UK as well. But at the same time, I'm always very skeptical about comparative studies, because I think there has to be a very clear unit of analysis that allows for that comparison. So part of the plan for me is to see where those exist, because clearly there will be some things that are comparable, and where things aren't necessarily comparable, then just leave them as they are and approach them as standalone and see how we can maybe aggregate the information at some point. So there will be room for some comparison, but I'm not starting off with it being a comparative analysis, because the contexts are slightly different and maybe very different in some instances.
Thank you so much. I'm just thinking, Dr. Obani, there's an event taking place later in the year at the university, right, around some of these subjects. Is it? I think it's on the 6th of November, I'm
November,
seeing.
yeah.
Yeah. Would you be able to say a little bit more about that? Because just with the questions coming in, I wonder whether alumni would be interested in attending that once we present more information on the sign up.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so it's I'm really excited about that one, to be honest. Because what we're planning to do with that event is to have a big conversation on this topics of women's experiences of climate change. But it's not going to be just people being spoken to. What we want is for people to be involved in the process. So it's meant to be an immersive experience where people are able to sort of share their views in different languages, using different creative art forms and all of that. And I think the information is out there already. So there will be a panel, and that panel will draw from some key players in the field. I don't think we've put out the details of who's going to be there yet, but what I'll just say is it does promise to be exciting, and it's an important opportunity for all of us to be involved. And one of the things I'm looking forward to is, for instance, seeing the views from different people and how it's projected, what we come out with collectively, because that's part of the process of democratizing the conversation and taking it beyond the confines of the ivory towers and just making it real and relevant for people out there.
Fantastic. And we'll be sending out a mailing with information about the event and how to sign up as things progress. But that promises to be very exciting. So do look out for that in your inboxes. And we've got quite a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to give you the next couple ones together because they're more about the research, and one asked for an example as well. So the first one is firstly saying thank you for the insightful presentation. Do you see any temporal peak events, i.e. after flooding or drought, that accelerate the alienation of women in fragile contexts, / women more harshly, like girls not returning to school? And the second question is, what kind of legal measures that you think to put in place for women to have access to climate justice? Can you give an example from Nigeria? So those are two questions I thought I'd ask together. So firstly, it's do you see any temporal peak events, i.e. after flooding or drought, that accelerate the alienation of women in fragile contexts?
Thank you very much. So yes, I think that's very common actually. So for instance, if there's a flooding, what you find is we had people saying, when there's a flood, for those who sell in the markets, now they've got open markets. For those who sell in the markets, people just won't come to the market to shop because they're not able to access the stores. So that's a very practical example of the ways in which people are impacted. Now, a lot of the people who will be selling in those markets are women. And so they would lose patronage because there's a flood and people aren't able to access them. But by extension, it also means that for those who need the supplies from the markets to be able to provide care at home, whether it's food or whether it's detergents, whatever it is they need to shop for, they also can't access those things. So there's an additional burden. And the other thing is, if because there's a flood, you find that, say, schools are closed, same thing, more caring responsibilities. We just need to think back to COVID, for instance, the lockdowns and the pandemics, and the ways in which that lockdown impacted on women. And it was very clear there was increase in incidents of domestic violence. There was increase in caring responsibilities. And even when people were able to work from home, there was the additional burden for those who were carers because they were now working full time and caring full time. And they didn't even have that reprieve of few hours. Maybe if it's a child, they go off to school, you can do something else. So it was full. And they also didn't have the opportunity to engage in the kinds of stress relief they would engage in. So, for instance, those who would be able to go to, I don't know, just take a walk out there, go to a spa, whatever, it just wasn't there. Go to the cinemas, it wasn't there. So, very often, those peak events, as you've called them, in the immediate aftermath, trigger a disproportionate and significant impact on the women. But the thing is, even when they end, those impacts don't necessarily go away, which is the point to the research. Because what we find is that, sadly, when there's a peak event like that, if I use that term, there's a lot of attention, and chances are that maybe people will try to do something in the immediate aftermath. But as soon as it subsides, then attention moves away. But unfortunately, the women would still be left with those impacts. So those are the kinds of things that create even more burdens for them. And that's why there's a need for us to explore these kinds of studies to see how we can make the process mitigate the adverse impacts essentially. And so the second one, in terms of legal measures, there are a lot of things that are already coming through. And um, um, I don't want to give away too much at this point, but what I would say is one of the first things would be that, and this is not necessarily a legal measure, this is more a governance thing, but one of the first things would be to disaggregate the data. So if there's a flood, for instance, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, whoever should be able to say this flood has affected this number of people, this number of women, or this number of men. And the reason for that is because it then begins to give us a basis to start taking action that is well targeted and that is effective. So if there's a flood affecting a health center, for instance, if we knew who's using the health center, what are they using it for? How are they accessing it? Then we will be able to provide an alternative that is targeted and addresses the gap that has been created by that issue. So one of the first things I would say is the need for data and data that is gender disaggregated. And the second thing would be to say that the legal processes have to be more accessible for women, both in terms of the cost and in terms of even the representation. Because if we do not have women in courts, whether as judges or as lawyers, then that in itself is a barrier because sometimes people just won't approach the institution because they don't see themselves reflected in that institution. So these are some of the measures that I think would be really very relevant based on the findings so far and across the various countries as well.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating, and fascinating to think of the data as one of the first points to take action is to get that data. Thank you so much, Dr. Obani. We've got a question from, say, Jawad. How can traditional resistance to gender inclusion be addressed in traditionally male-dominated policy environments? I think it's something you're already touching on, but would love to hear more there, Dr. Obani.
Thank you so much for the question. And I think it's a very important one. I was having a conversation with someone a few days ago, and I was saying the first thing to do is if I'm going into a community to speak to the women, I'll speak to the men first because I need them on side. So personally, I think it's important to recognize the role of men, not just in a stereotypical way as gatekeepers, but as allies. So I like to start from a position of positivity and a position of strength. And so I think about them more as allies and try to build that relationship with them. And that's the reason why, even though this research is about women, I'm speaking to everyone because I always say women know what they need. If you ask them, they'll tell you. But it's important for everyone else to know what they need and to support women through that process. So the idea is if we go into a community, we have to speak to the men. They have to be part of the conversation. And in fact, in the design of the focus group and workshops, it's the same thing to speak to both men and women and to show them the ways in which their experiences are different. And that's where the creative arts comes in. So one of the other things is to try and use the creative arts as a way of then appealing to those perceptions and deep-seated values which people hold. Because sometimes I feel honestly that people don't understand the impacts of, or we don't understand the impacts of our actions and inactions until it's played back to us. So that's one of the things I want to explore through this research, playing back the actions, the inactions, and the outcomes, and allowing people to engage in that process and try to get some kind of transformative outcomes through just exploring and interrogating why they do what they do, how they do it, how it lands on the next person, and how to make it better.
Thank you. I think one of the things I find so fascinating about this is the interdisciplinary nature. And when you mention, for instance, the creative arts coming in, it goes into so many different areas. It's really, really interesting. We've got a question here from Joanna. What are some of the challenges you have faced in the course of this project, and how have you been able to surmount them? Great question, Joanna.
How much time do you have, Joanne? Thank you. Well, I think the first thing is to say that it's a multi-country study. So it goes without saying that there'll be lots of challenges. And the second thing is it's a fairly innovative area, is emerging, is an emerging area. So there are some challenges around just getting the data that one needs. There are some challenges even around communicating the idea, because sometimes it's when it comes to women's issues and gender issues, there are all sorts of barriers in having a clear conversation about it. Because very often whoever you approach has a position already. They're either for or against. And it's always a process trying to communicate in a way that you can cut across the barriers and then get those who may not necessarily see the point to any of this to come on side and be engaged in the process, because you need everybody on board. So some of the challenges have been around the communication of the idea and getting people to be invested in it. Another barrier has been building trust, because a lot of the times when it comes to research, um, it's very easy for research to either be exploitative or to be seen as being exploitative. So for me, one of the key challenges is because I don't see this as just another piece of research, academic work. I mean, I could sit in my office and write the papers if that's what I wanted to do, but this needs to make a difference. And so for me, a key challenge is how do I translate this into something that makes a difference out there in the real world for real people? And so in doing that, it sometimes means that I have to I have to put on different hats. So I have to think not just as an academic, but I have to think as someone out there in the streets. I have to think as different communities of practice. And that takes time. Just understanding those communities of practice in a way that is not patronizing. So it means spending time with various communities of practice, engaging with them, trying to learn the language, trying to understand that language, and trying to build the trust to ensure that they are partners in this piece of work. So those are some of the key challenges that I've experienced. But in all, I think it's part of the process. And so I wouldn't necessarily change it for anything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obani. We've got a couple more questions. We have the webinar going until till 12 noon. So if anyone has any final questions, uh, do pop them in the Q&A. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear the questions and hear the answers so far. We've got another question from Jawad here. How can educational institutions and civil society organisations contribute to building awareness and capacity in gender inclusive climate governments?
Thank you for that question. And that's a very good one because, again, those are some of the things that we're focused on for this research. So when it comes to education, for instance, that's a big area because what we're finding is that in many instances, there's absolutely nothing on climate education, or if it exists, it's nothing to do with the feminist perspectives. It's just taught as a almost a technocratic, purely scientific topic, and that's it. So these are the problems and these are the solutions. And so one of the things that education, one of the key roles of educational institutions is to bridge that gap between the natural sciences and all those facts about climate change and the impacts it's having, the real stories out there, because they don't necessarily exist in silos. They actually exist, coexisting in the real world. So educational institutions need to think about curriculums that are responsive to those intersections between the sciences and everything else around climate change, and try to present that in a language that is accessible. Because again, when we ask people what is climate change, people don't necessarily respond to that. But if you start asking people about the temperature, if you ask them about snow, heat, is it coming when you expect it? Has there been any changes? It changes the conversation completely. And if you ask them about it in a way that means something for them, so if you ask them and you say, oh, so how is this affecting your ability to go to work? How is it affecting your ability to get food? How is it even affecting the kind of food you eat, when you eat it, and how you cook it? They start responding. So it just means that educational institutions need to be rethinking the ways in which they conceptualize the problem and they conceptualize the learning materials and they present them. The other thing is, and I guess this is a bit, but I'll say it anyway. The other thing is even the language we use, because I teach sustainable development law and policy. And one of the first questions I ask, and I notice we have a mixed audience here in terms of people from different parts of the world. One of the questions I ask is, what is sustainable development in other languages but English? So we take it for granted that we're all talking about the same thing, sustainable development. We know what it means. It's about ensuring that we meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. Excellent. But how does that translate into a local language in Kenya, in South Africa, in Nigeria? How do we communicate sustainable development in a way that makes sense in these different languages if we're going to be asking these people to contribute to the conversations and to the actions to achieve sustainable development? So again, I think another priority for both the educational institutions, but also the civil society, is to rethink the language of communication of these concepts and principles and ideas, and ensure that that language is reflective of the context within which we want to be taking action.
Thank you so much. It sounds like it's the what of the research, but also it's the how is so important. Yeah. It opens it up so much, and it's absolutely fascinating. We've got a question here from Alia on varied impacts experienced by women. The question is, are there any indication on a relationship between women's experiences of hardship with climate change and changing patterns in intimate partner violence? And she apologised there that the research, if the research doesn't cover it, and mentioned they joined a bit late, because I think it's something you touched on earlier. But would you be able to speak a bit further to that, Dr. Obani, please?
Yes, no, thank you very much for that question. I think that early indications show that there is a connection. So, for instance, there was some account of someone mentioned how this is a group of women in a coastal area that had been experiencing flooding. And so they mentioned how when they would experience flooding and they weren't able to trade and the men weren't able to fish, it would lead to frustration. And the men would ask the women, because of course they'd lost their livelihoods, they would be asking for money and upkeep from the women. And if the women weren't able to provide or didn't want to share, it would lead to an increase in domestic violence. So that's something that came through already. There was another person who shared about how for her, it was just the heat. This was a different context now, the heat. And just being out there in the hot weather, dry weather, she was always coming back exhausted, tired at the end of the day, and she just didn't want to engage in intimate relationships with her husband, and that led to the breakdown of that relationship. So these are some indications that we have found, and the reason I've mentioned this too is also because they show very different contexts, same country but different contexts. So one was flooding leading to domestic violence, and the other one was drought, again leading to adverse impacts on family relationships. So these already exist. And I think there are lots of other stories that sort of correspond with these experiences as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Obani. We'll finish with a question from Catherine here, who says, thank you so much for all of this. This wide interdisciplinary overview is so essential. And Catherine has a lot of questions. But the question we'll finish with today is, how will your research program ensure that the data you've gathered is disaggregated?
Thank you very much. So one of the things that we're doing is when we have the workshops or focus group discussions, on the one hand, we try to, depending on the numbers, we try to have different groups of just men, just women, and a mixed group. And then record the responses from each of these groups as a way of ensuring that we're able to disaggregate the information. And even when we speak to a group, whether it's a mixed group or a single sex group, whatever it is, we always highlight who's come up with this experience. Has it been is it an experience that has been shared by most of the women or most of the men, or is it something that is experienced by everybody? So we try to keep that in the data that we collect. The other thing we're trying to do is also advocacy. So as we speak to government ministries, departments, and agencies, we're trying to encourage them to do the same in terms of disaggregating the data so that we're able to build this body of evidence that actually shows the varied impacts of climate change on various people.
Thank you so
Yes,
much.
and I see the comment from
Yeah,
Cathy Grant, and I think that's absolutely right. You know, sustainable government. Exactly, what does it mean? So even though, I mean, in academic circles, would like to think that we know what it means, but clearly it is difficult to translate, and that's why there's so many different perspectives in terms of what is actually sustainable. So we may all agree that we want to achieve sustainable development, but how we do it will be very different, you know.
thank you so much, Dr. Abadi. Well, thank you for your presentation today and for answering these questions with such detail. And thank you to our alumni as well for asking these questions. It strikes me that this is such a forward-looking topic, and it is exciting that there's going to be opportunities to discuss it further. And alumni, if you are able to attend our event later in the year on the 6th of November around this topic, that would be fantastic. Because it feels like this is the start of a conversation. And just to say, hearing the presentation makes me very proud to work alongside you, Dr. Abani. Thank you for sharing all of this.